Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 2016 Hack Summit. We're joined today by Jocelyn Goldfein, a former engineering director at Facebook, as well as a former VP of engineering at VMware, and her experience includes a broad set of domains, including highly customized enterprise middleware, operating systems, consumer web and mobile apps, shrink-wrapped software, developer tools, and big data. She's currently an investor and an advisor to multiple startups, considers herself to be very passionate about building successful startups, and assists startups in reinforcing their culture, as well as working through deep technology issues. Jocelyn, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Ed.
Great. So, there's a lot of aspiring open source developers in the audience, Jocelyn, who I think one day may dream about building their own startup. So I think they can learn a lot from your relevant experience here. So audience, please feel free to ask questions to Jocelyn in the Q&A section of the Crowdcast here, and we'll get to those after Jocelyn's presentation is over. And Jocelyn, if there's any questions you want to ask the audience, just let me know and we can poll the audience and ask them questions.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go ahead and hand camera control off to you.
Sounds good. Do I have the, have I got the camera now?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, I am going to share my screen and hopefully everyone can now see my slides. So Ed, thank you for the great intro. I think you made the point I like to make standing here on this title slide, which is that I've made a lot of different kinds of software under a lot of different conditions. And I've had a bunch of these epiphanies over my career about, oh my God, I've discovered this silver bullet. Why doesn't everybody know this is the right thing to do? And so having gotten to make so many different kinds of software, from web to mobile to operating system, in so many different domains, whether it's free or ad supported, what I'd really like to do today is reveal to you sort of those true secrets, the one right way to ship software. And it's embarrassing, but I can't. There isn't one right way. And every time I had one of those epiphanies, every time I thought I had found something that was sort of dramatically different and redefined the way software should be made, I found it was kind of ephemeral, and it could work amazingly in one situation, and not work at all in another. And so if I have a secret to impart, it's this: all those things that we want to accomplish when we ship software are in a trade-off space with each other. Of course, we want to ship features. That's the whole point. Software without features is kind of meaningless. But those features don't actually deliver any value for our users if they're not of high quality, whether that's high design quality or reliability or secure or performant or accessible. We might care about broad platform support. We might care about shipping often, so updating quickly. We might care about shipping things when we say we will ship them. And all of those things exist in tension with one another. We may discover tools or platforms or technology that moves the trade-off curve. And yes, we may discover release processes that move the trade-off curve. But at the end of the day, every release process is optimizing for some of these things at the cost of other things. And so the name of the game, in truth, is to figure out which trade-offs, what you should be optimizing for, and what release processes help you accomplish what you need and do not burden you with overhead from things you don't need. And so how do you decide what it is that you need? How do you decide what things on this list you should be optimizing for? Is it just sort of, founder personality? I feel like between Facebook and VMware, you could not imagine two companies that ship software in more different ways. And you might attribute that to the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has a very different personality than Diane Greene and Mendel Rosenblum. But it has nothing to do with founder personality. I would argue that it has to do with more fundamental structures. I'm showing you a picture of the Guggenheim Museum, which is widely considered one of the most stunning examples of the architectural principle that form should follow function, that we should design spaces for the ways that people will use them. And I believe that the same is true about release process, that it has to be responsive to our needs, and it has to be responsive to our underlying structural capabilities. And I think that comes not from founder personality, not from preference or ideology, but basically from the technologies that we use and what our company business model or mission is attempting to accomplish. So let's talk about those two things. Let's start with technology stack. Let's put this on a spectrum from, operating systems over here on the left, where you're all the way close to the metal, building up to sort of native apps, which sit on top of an operating system. Sort of mobile apps, I would say, are native, but maybe have a little bit more of their brains off in the cloud, or a little lighter weight. And all the way sort of up the stack, sitting on top of more and more layers of abstraction between you and the metal, the web. And the more layers of abstraction you sit on top of, the more functionality you get for free, but the less of your stack you control. So it might be easier to get features written the higher in the stack you go, but it might be harder to ensure that they're really fast or really reliable. But perhaps the biggest difference about your technology that your technology stack makes is simply how you deploy. And that when you deploy in the cloud, which is usually the case on web or any kind of backend server, you're deploying onto systems that you control. And when you're deploying on-prem, or really in any situation where you're deploying onto a device that you don't control, that the end user or end customer controls, you are radically increasing the cost of a release for two reasons. One, if you have to go through somebody else to update the software, you're at somebody else's mercy. It's not in your control. And two, you don't control the environment you're deploying into, whereas you have absolute control over that when you're deploying in the cloud. So we're talking about an exponential reduction in things like test matrix. So when you think about the radically different cost of a release depending on your technology stack, that right there makes an immense difference in what kind of release processes will make sense for you, if a release is cheap or expensive. Second, consider, what is your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish with your product or your startup or your technology? And again, if we think about the world, as a spectrum with business models ranging from, sort of the first company I worked for out of college called Trilogy sold software for $50 million, at a pop. So as expensive as it gets. VMware was actually remarkably cheap as enterprise software goes. It was only a couple of $1,000s. And there's certainly consumer software that we spend hundreds of dollars on, down to, I toss a couple bucks a year to Candy Crush. And we have ad-supported and truly free software, of course. And how you make your money is a pretty useful proxy for how you're creating impact in the world. And so another rule of thumb here is, if somebody's paying a lot of money for your software, it is because you meet some business need for them. And so their expectation is that you will be very reliable and very predictable. You might think that companies want features, who spend lots of money on your software, want features as soon as possible. Well, they do, all else being equal, but it is even more important to them that they know when the features are coming, because for them to change the way they do work, to incorporate your software, they need lead time, and they need to be able to sort of satisfy their own internal dependency chains. And so the expectations of reliability and predictability when somebody's betting their business on you are really high. And so you might think, okay, so if the cheaper my software is, the lower the expectations are. Great. Not quite so simple. Business users use software because they have to, because they need it. At the sort of ad-supported free end of the spectrum, consumers are using your software kind of because they want to, not because they have to. Usually for something to be free, it's either not mission critical, or there's many alternatives, or there's some other sort of basic way in which consumers have a lot of choice. And if that's the case, then by and large, users use your software because they want to, not because they have to, which means, conversely, that UX expectations are often much higher for consumer software than enterprise software. I don't want to sort of simplify the world into just enterprise and consumer software. I totally acknowledge that there are other business models that exist, but sort of this idea of what are the expectations for your software, is the mission you serve better accomplished if you ship features more often, if you have higher throughput of features, if you are more predictable, if you're more reliable. That's, I think, true of you can sort of apply that thinking to any kind of a business model. And even if you're not making money, even if you are purely an open source technology, you have some other metric like adoption or usage that reflects how much total impact you're having. So I want to pause and issue a caveat here that, of course, technology and business model are not the only inputs into what trade-offs you might make or what priorities you might have for your release process. And that, a big one is, are you optimizing for growth or for recurring revenue? One reason that might matter is if you ship a lot of bugs today, if you're going to have a whole lot more customers tomorrow who won't know about these bugs, maybe that's less of a big deal. Certainly those inputs exist, but I'm actually not going to talk about them for this talk. So let's do the thing that we can do when we have established that we're talking about two different spectrums, and let's just sort of throw them together and put them on a plane. And if we do that, we can talk about startups and technology companies in the context of where they fall in this axis. And so I'm showing you a map here of all the different companies I've worked for, and boy, I haven't done a very good job of harvesting what I've learned by doing the same thing more than once. So I started actually as a college student. I was a summer intern at Netscape. So I started here in the top left quadrant of building native software, desktop apps that were free. And I proceeded to Trilogy, which was also client-server software, but all of it delivered on-prem, which sold for a lot of money. I did my own startup called Message One, which I don't expect you to have heard of, but here in this web enterprise space, companies that you know about, think of Salesforce or Workday, right? We're selling software to businesses that is web-based. Bounced back over to VMware, shipping operating systems to enterprises for a good amount of money, and then went to VMware's diametric opposite at Facebook, where I lived here in the upper right-hand corner of web and free. And, Facebook was born in the era of the web. Unlike older software companies, had really few or no assumptions that came from the desktop era. And it made the most of the fact that, that the cost of a release was all but free. And its entire release process was optimized around that. Whereas at VMware, release processes could not have been more expensive. We shipped maybe once a year would be fast, once every 2 years for a major release. And then Facebook, while I was there, underwent this transition where we really, although we continued to ship web software, had to pivot to mobile and deliver mobile apps. And the striking thing about that is that shipping a mobile app actually has a little bit more in common with shipping an operating system than it does with shipping a website. And that was a difficult transition for Facebook to make. So if you think about companies in these four quadrants, and you buy my argument that your business model and your technology stack shape your priorities, for your release process, you would expect to see companies in each of these quadrants to sort of more resemble one another than they do across the quadrants. And I think that that's intuitive, right? If you sort of, imagine a typical slogan or a typical release culture, up here in the kind of consumer web space, move fast and break things is the Facebook slogan, but you can, easily imagine that applying to others in that space as you sort of move left and think about consumer native software, whether you're talking about Oculus or Xbox, coming up with games companies here, Mozilla. You're really focused on delighting users, on winning their hearts and making something that's sort of very high quality from that perspective. Coming down, I think enterprise native software, really reliability is the key. And when you think about the birth of the web for enterprise, we think of Salesforce and their sort of the end of software slogan, and the idea that it's hassle-free. The idea that by taking maintenance and uptime away from enterprises and deploying in the cloud, you're sort of enabling speed and convenience for enterprises. So I think sort of, hopefully this all resonates. If I were giving this talk in person, now would be the moment where I'd pause and ask you to ask for sort of the show of hands of, who identifies with which quadrant. But I think rather than interrupt the screencast, I'll put that for the end. So let's talk about one example of a priority that is shaped by your business model and your technology stack, your deployment model. And that's the cost of a mistake. And that affects sort of a really central portion of your release process, which is, how risk averse are you, or conversely, how risk-seeking. So if you think about a mistake, a bug that makes it to production, or an outage, there is some, there's some innate severity of that bug, in its own right. And, severe bugs can happen to you, in any of these quadrants. Bugs are bad. They're also inevitable. And so let's call that sort of innate severity of a bug X. And let's further stipulate that the cost of the bug, that sort of, we're talking about an equivalently severe bug in every quadrant. Well, what makes a mistake costly? What makes a mistake expensive or minimal? And I think at the end of the day, it's about pain that it causes your users. It's, to some extent, it's the scramble and the pain it causes you to fix it. But truthfully, the real cost of a bug is not your cost to fix it. It's how it's how badly it harms your relationship and the business of what you were trying to do for people in the world, your mission. And so if you think about harm to your users, there is, how bad was the mistake for them? And then also, how long did it last? And so what I would say is that, here on the right, where you're deploying code onto your own servers, onto devices you control on the web or the back end, or a back end service, you are, you have some innate cost of fixing this bug, whatever it is. But you can fix it almost as fast as possible. As soon as your developers can literally write code and test it, you can ship the fix. If you move to the left, you are now talking about a world in which you have to spin up a new release vehicle. Maybe for a mobile app that's as lightweight as pushing something new to the App Store. In the bad old days, we had to mail CDs to people and hope they would get around to installing them. But as the cost of a release goes up, the time it takes to fix a bug becomes, much greater. Let's call it an order of magnitude greater, and say, however severe the bug was, if you have to ship code out to an end user and they have to install the fix, that bug is 10 times worse. The cost of the mistake is 10 times worse because it takes an order of magnitude longer to fix. All right, now let's think about the severity to your users. If you are in the category of entertainment or something consumers are not paying very much money for, then you are probably in the realm of something that people want to be using, not something people must be using, or something that they have alternatives to. And so again, if you suffer an outage, if you're unavailable, if you're down, probably people can live with that. Twitter, when in its early days was dealing with, scaling far beyond what it, when Twitter was dealing with exponential growth in users, they had scaling issues all the time. And it became, and there's sort of little fail whale that they put up became so distinctive, that we sort of joked about the fail whale. It was, Twitter's having an outage again, haha, right? Like, and for all that, Twitter is doing well at Pearly today, the fail whale was not fatal for Twitter. If Twitter was down, we went away and we came back an hour or two later when they had things straight. And so, on the other hand, if you imagine Salesforce having outages like that all the time in its early days, that's probably a business that doesn't get off the ground. Salesforce, if I'm a sales guy and I'm relying on Salesforce to call on customers or to book revenue, and it's down all the time, forget it. I'm going back to Siebel. I'm going back to on-premise software. Salesforce doesn't get off the ground. So the more customers are relying on your software to be mission critical, to be there for them where they can't accomplish their work, the more likely that an outage is going to cost you customers, and it's going to cost them business, that it's going to be sort of fatally painful for them. So, so if you think about moving down from sort of free to more expensive, more mission critical for your users, the cost of a mistake, I would argue, is also 10 times greater. And then, the slide sort of gives away the punchline, which is if you move down and to the left, if you both take a long time to fix problems and the consequences of your problems are very, very severe for your customers, well, that's not just additive. It's exponential because it's multiplicative. And so you're looking at 2 orders of magnitude greater cost of a mistake. So if you are Facebook and if you are VMware, it makes utter sense that one of these companies could be very risk-seeking and the other could be very risk-averse, and that they would come up with really different release processes and really different beliefs about how acceptable it was to take a risk of shipping a bug, because they're in a completely different position to fix it. So with that in mind, you can also start to stereotype what kinds of release processes you might typically see at these kinds of companies. When releases are cheap, you can have fast, short cycles. When you have a comparatively smaller number of users paying higher dollars, you can spend more time with them and be more directly responsive to their needs. So you see probably the fastest, shortest cycles on the upper right when, and this is on a spectrum. A mobile app can have a faster release cycle than an operating system. But you can already sort of sense or see the ways in which the constraints and the priorities shape the kinds of release processes you have. And by the way, I don't really think that sort of anybody's going to see these slides and go, oh my gosh, I was using fast short cycles and metric-centric release to try to make an operating system. I had it all wrong. I think that, I think by and large, for the same reason that evolution works through sheer Darwinian processes, I think because you are in the business you're in, because you use the technology you use, by and large, most people find their way to the right release process for the quadrant that they're in. It's more the case that I want to get you to sort of second guess, oh wait, I'm following this release process because I tried lots of things and this was the one that works. Sort of evolution took me in this direction, but maybe I should realize that it works situationally. It works because of the context I'm in and because of the environment I'm in, and it might not be universal. And so that, I think, brings me to sort of one of the I think real pitfalls, and why I think it's sort of important to give this talk and what I think there is to be learned from it. I don't actually think that I'm going to teach you what release process you should be using, but I hope I can teach you not to get religious. And I realize that's a tall order. I think as software engineers, we love to be religious. We can, start holy wars over tab spaces and, choices of text editors. So of course we get religious about our release process, especially when we've had our own lived experiences in which we've had these magical revelations of, oh my God, A/B testing, it really works. Oh my God, writing incredibly thorough, detailed specs and estimates enables me to be super efficient and deliver exactly what I said I would when I said I'd do it. And so we have these sort of conversion experiences. But then the trouble is, when you think you've found a natural law and you try to apply it everywhere, you can run into trouble when conditions change. If any of these things we're finding are natural law, there's something like the law of gravity, which changes depending on what planet you're on. And so, I think this is sort of particularly an important point for startups to understand, because you're quite likely to pivot. You might be making productivity software for consumers and decide, actually, this needs to be an enterprise app. Well, you haven't just changed your business model. You don't just need to go hire some salespeople. You actually, have now got to think about, well, how do I make software differently when I'm making enterprise software than consumer software? And that means that I need release process change. But because people are sort of religious in their beliefs about how we should release software, what we really need is culture change. And changing process is easy. Changing culture is hard. And sort of pivoting is one story, because there at least you're sort of changing your culture. You may go to a culture of being customer-centric, for example, but at least you still have one culture and sort of you can galvanize everybody to be on one bus. I think the real challenges happen when you're successful and your business expands enough that you start to need to shift software that lives in multiple quadrants. And it's very hard to tolerate multiple dissenting cultures under the same roof. I've never worked at Microsoft, full disclosure, but I have talked to a lot of software engineers who used to work on Bing. And, Microsoft is sort of a classic example of a top left, bottom left kind of company that has, its birth in expensive releases. The sort of Microsoft execs are famous for coining the phrase, shipping is a feature, right? Because the cost of a release itself is so high when you're shipping Windows or Microsoft Office. And so in a culture like that, the ability to ship predictably, to do what you said when you would do it, is sort of deeply embedded in the values and culture. Well, one thing that becomes the case, once releases are cheap or free, the value of predictability is very small. by the way, predictability is super expensive. And so you get a lot of mileage, a lot of engineer productivity, a lot of features, a lot of quality by tossing predictability out the window. And I'm fairly convinced that Bing, when Microsoft entered sort of this web consumer space, they didn't fully embrace all the benefits of moving quickly and constantly course correcting. Not because, they sort of wrongly thought that they needed to have deadlines for some arbitrary reason, but because it was so deeply baked in their assumption that a good engineer is one who provides good estimates and a good manager is one who ships the release on time, that they could not shake those roots and couldn't really take advantage of the new planet they were on and the different law of gravity. But I think probably the most extensive experience I have with watching this kind of expansion or descent is definitely Facebook's transition to mobile, which I was at the center of. And Facebook had many transitions to mobile. I mean, obviously, sort of most famously, Facebook started approaching mobile with HTML5 and hoping that we didn't actually have to make this transition, that we could just stick with web. And we couldn't, because web didn't let us deliver the user experience that consumers wanted. And so we had to move to shipping native software and making that the sort of primary vehicle. And so Facebook started hiring a bunch of people who knew how to make native apps, whether those were, mobile developers or traditional desktop developers. And those people brought with them all kinds of new release process, like specs and UI freeze and QA. And this was a tricky import, especially once we came to a point where we said, all right, we don't want to have separate web and mobile teams. We want to have the newsfeed team on newsfeed, whether it's web or mobile. If mobile's first, the newsfeed team needs to build newsfeed for mobile, not some other mobile team. Messaging, photos, each of these product teams need to own and take responsibility for their mobile experience. And so we had a bunch of engineers and designers and product managers who had grown up in the Facebook web culture of releases are free, therefore constant iteration through shipping more releases is how you get quality, is how you get design. And that sort of spirit of constant experimentation was really central to the Facebook concept of how you deliver high quality software. Meanwhile, you have these folks who are relative newcomers to Facebook, who have only worked on the mobile apps at Facebook, to whom it's obvious that releases are expensive, and who think it's kind of crazy not to have QA, and think that it's irresponsible. And so, because neither of these sides really recognized that their culture and philosophy around shipping software was actually just rooted in their technology stack. The fact that web and mobile are different and the cost of a release is different. They viewed themselves not just as, disagreeing about process. Like, this became a conversation that was about, like, you guys are a moral hazard to the culture and identity of the company. And it was a passionate and emotional exchange. And so, when you wonder, gee, why did it take Facebook so long? And why was it so hard? I mean, it's not because, Java and Objective-C are complicated languages, or Android and iOS are difficult frameworks to pick up. It was simply this, that we had to find a way to sort of solve this schism about what is the best way to make software. And by the way, I don't mean to imply that the mobile guys were completely right and sort of the Facebook web guys were completely wrong, although it was true that the cost of a release is higher on mobile, and that the traditional ways of sort of freewheeling experimentation and change that Facebook for web utilized, that was not directly applicable to mobile. At the same time, like, Facebook's a really different company than Apple or some of the other places that these guys had come from, and Facebook could afford to take more risks in some other respects. And we could also move the trade-off curve by making release cycles shorter. Just going from 4-week to 2-week release cycles on mobile, for example, has really been beneficial, and introducing beta programs has made enormous differences. So there needed to be open-mindedness on both sides about the fact that, you know, engineers needed to stop asking the question, is this process right or wrong? And instead ask, is this well suited to what we're trying to accomplish? The story has a happy ending. Ultimately, I mean, I think Facebook's mobile apps today are pretty good and constantly improving. And ultimately, the key to kind of bringing these two groups together, you know, there's lots of sort of blocking and tackling and sort of getting people in a room and getting them to talk and maybe getting even people to switch teams and to become really trusted and do work for each other. But I think one of the biggest and most important breakthroughs was simply this, that both sides could really agree on values. Both sides could really agree that what Facebook needed was to deliver the best possible software for its community of users. And if they could start from that and sort of hugging out that we agreed on that, then we could have a discussion about how best to serve those users. And so that sort of values alignment, I think, accomplished a lot. And so your business model may change, your technology stack may change, your release process hopefully will change when those things happen. Your culture may need to change. You know, we see startups influx all the time, and finding that they need culture change in order to sort of thrive and prosper when their business conditions alter. But hopefully your values and your mission do not change, and that those become the guide. So if I can leave you with a few takeaways, you know, I don't think you're going to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and figure out what your release methodology ought to be based on this framework. I think you've already got a release methodology, and it probably is based on your experiences, and you probably have found your way to what works right for you. But do sort of be really thoughtful when your conditions change about changing the way you release, and being willing and open-minded about changing your culture. If the cost of a mistake goes up by an order of magnitude, think about being a little more risk averse. And I think that likewise, when you pivot or change quadrants or be so lucky that your business grows and expands across multiple quadrants, the most important thing to consider upfront is culture. That people see these changes not as attacks on the moral fiber of the company, but as like a natural alteration, that is a natural evolution, that is a response to changing conditions. And that if you have two different groups which adopt really different release practices, and one group has QA and one group does not, doesn't mean one group is sort of a moral hazard to the company. It probably, hopefully means that they're just making really different kinds of software for different kinds of audiences. I run into a lot of startups who are eager to take advice on what their release process should be like, or even want to go so far as to hire a VP of engineering or some kind of engineering or product leadership who's seen the movie before, so that the startup doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. And, you know, I think that's fine. I think it's fine to hire for expertise, although I think you also should hire for potential. But if you're going to hire someone because they're an expert, do make sure to hire the right kind of expertise. Like, you know, if you make, you know, enterprise operating systems, then as much as you may admire Google, you know, someone who comes out of Google search might not have expertise that is quite relevant to your business. Not to say you shouldn't hire them, but maybe you shouldn't hire them for their expertise, just for their potential. Last but not least, because you're going to be hiring a lot of people who come from different quadrants and who come in with different assumptions about the right and wrong ways to ship software, it's really important that you onboard them very thoughtfully, and that you introduce them to your culture and your practices, and situate and help them kind of reinvent themselves for your environment, and help them understand why your environment is different than the ones that they came out of, because people will blindly tend to bring the practices of what they experienced before. So hopefully you find this a sort of helpful insight in how you think about your own technology, your own development practices, your own process of shipping. And if I've inspired you to know yourself and to calibrate and to tie your culture and practices a little more closely to your business model, your mission, your technology, your deployment model, then I'm happy to have helped. And this sounds like, maybe I need to.
Great, thank you so much, Jocelyn. That's a great presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine, but there we go.
Yeah, you're
All right,
back.
can you see my face now instead of the infinity window?
Yeah, it looks great. By the way, you might want to turn down the speakers just a little bit. There might be a little bit of a feedback loop. So great presentation, Jocelyn. It was fascinating. And we've got a bunch of audience questions to go through here. But before we go into that, I was kind of curious about something myself. So I kind of noticed the trend on, especially with Facebook mobile over time, where initially, I guess, there was experimentation around doing HTML5 and maybe even talk about HTML5 hybrid. And LinkedIn was also kind of in this camp. They had an HTML5 hybrid app. And I've noticed a trend where they've started to shift away more towards native over time. And there was kind of this stigma in the ecosystem that HTML5 may not be as rosy as everyone had thought. So what do you think the future is here for HTML5? Like, do you think that it's a solid choice these days?
Yeah.
Have things improved? Like, what do you think?
I'm going to be showing my gray hairs here. Because I feel like the conversation we're having right now really reminds me of a conversation that we had in the late 90s and early 2000s. So yes, Facebook was born on web. It was very natural to them to try to extend the web platform onto mobile. They certainly didn't want to have to deal with, you know, a proliferation of platforms, with QA, with test matrices, with app stores. You know, their culture of sort of constant experimentation, all of that really lent itself to HTML5. And, you know, the problem was when the rubber met the road, we weren't delivering a good enough UX. We weren't delivering a good enough experience for our mobile users. And if you sort of think back to, well, what business is in Facebook in? They're in the business of people have to want to use Facebook because they don't need to. And so user experience is paramount. And so Facebook quite rightly made the decision to move to native apps because native, you know, it wasn't just for functionality like the camera and notifications. It really is, you can deliver the kind of responsive interactiveness that users want. So that doesn't mean that HTML5 will never get there. I remember very keenly sort of the 98, 99, 2000 sort of, you know, the voice of companies like Microsoft, who had been building native apps, desktop apps since time immemorial, as the web came along, was, well, the web is fine for like static stuff or maybe like your little shopping cart app, but my application is very rich and interactive and has complex, you know, you're never going to be able to stuff a rich interactive application like mine into a web page. And, you know, a few years later, you know, I think really Google Maps was kind of the earth-shattering one, but Ajax comes along, you know, the state of the art gets better. And it wasn't just a matter of the web being able to deliver as good or better, because I think in truth, our capacity, our ability to build really rich, immersive desktop apps is still greater than our ability to deliver rich, immersive web apps. But it's good enough on the web, and the immense advantages that came from deploying in the cloud, the fact that they could update all the time, that they didn't need to go through users to install updates, and so new features could appear every day. The fact that it's sort of untethered developers from the release train cycle meant that and just the fact that you didn't have to you know, test. You didn't have a test matrix of every operating system version under the sun. You were deploying your code on an environment you controlled. Like, all those benefits meant that developer productivity is an order of magnitude greater on the web than on native. Like, let's be clear here. And so, and truthfully less because of HTML and more because you're running the software on your own device and not somebody else's.
And also because you don't have to go through the App Store release process and approvals to get feedback from users.
Everything, all of it, right? And so when I hear people say, oh, HTML5 can't possibly be as good as my native app for mobile, I'm like, well, that's going to be true until it's not. And the day it's good enough is going to be a day when developing for the web still has these order of magnitude benefits that native doesn't, because you can all of a sudden release is free again, and that moves the trade-off curve. What might be different this time is that Apple and Google may have more tight platform control than, ironically, Microsoft did over the desktop. And so they might or might not be friendly to allowing the web to be good enough on mobile. I think certainly it's good that we have two players and not a single player monopoly. But I'll stake my money now. I think the web will win again, unless Apple and Google go to really unnatural lengths to suppress web on mobile. And I name Apple and Google because they own the mobile platforms, Android and iOS. Unless they go to unnatural lengths, I think the web will win again.
It's going to be interesting to see how it all pans out, I think.
I don't know. I think today the right thing for a startup to do is probably a native UX, especially if you're building for consumer. But someday, I think we'll see the web.
I hope so. I love the idea of A/B testing quickly. Like I was building an MVP years ago, and I was experimenting with HTML5 and HTML5 hybrid, which I also thought was kind of interesting. The whole idea of having that native control. What do you think of that? Like, do you think that's an interesting paradigm? A hybrid apps?
Hybrid apps?
Yeah.
They feel pretty clunky to me right now, to be honest. I think it's fine to put up a web form for like your FAQ or, I think the seams show. And I think in some ways also you're not getting the full benefit of web because you still have to release the controls that are native. So, I think they might have a tactical purpose for, like, it really depends on the app. Like if it's mostly a native shell and it's mostly an HTML5 app, but you're native enough to have push notifications and a camera and that's all you need, like, go party. But I think, I think by and large, you're better off being purely one thing or purely the other.
Great. So let's go to some of these audience questions here. The first question with 154 votes by Alexi is, should you deliver now and fix later? Or should you fix now and deliver later? Kind of a broad question.
No, but that is absolutely depends on your business model. So should you deliver now and fix later? I think you can do that if, absolutely you can do that in consumer. You can do that when you have a large number of users, very few of whom pay you very much money, right? Because the thing that you're going to fix later presumably affects only a small percentage of them. It affects everyone. Obviously it's a fix now, but this is only a trade-off if like the bug is kind of survivable, right? If it's a fatal bug, of course, fix now. And so on the other hand, if in an enterprise world where, a small number of companies provide the bulk of your revenue and, the problem is one that affects their relationship with your brand, then, I would say fix now, deliver later. Of course, it all depends on the severity of the bug, but all else being equal, I think in a consumer business, and especially in a web-based deployment model where it's easy to fix and you can fix, Facebook has 2 release vehicles a day. And so VMware has, 2 release vehicles a year. So deliver now, fix later is really easy for Facebook to say and really easy for Facebook to do. If VMware doesn't fix now, deliver later, well, fix later is a long time later.
Yeah, I can imagine a financial institution, for example, that deals with cardholder data, absolutely needing to fix now and deliver later, just because the sensitivities of everything involved, and especially look at HIPAA compliant organizations and everything that's involved.
I think that's really the purpose of the talk. Is there's not one right answer to this. The answer is it depends. Of course, it depends on the bug, but like all bugs being equal, it depends on, I think, your business model and your deployment model more than anything else.
Great. So the next question here is from Martin with 120 votes. And he asks, what are the tools, technologies, and processes that make Facebook developers efficient, which may not be widespread or well-known outside of Facebook? So what can we learn from Facebook developers there?
Yeah, see, great question. So I think the fact that Facebook has pushed down the cost of releasing to nearly free has immense impact. And the other big luxury Facebook has that you don't have is 1 billion users. And so you can literally prototype some code. You can be noodling on a concept, prototype some code, turn it on, that day or the next day to 0.01% of English speaking users in Australia, gather a bunch of feedback in a couple hours and turn it off, right? All from sort of the comfort of your desk chair. And that means that you don't have to have like these long, detailed, drawn out specs, thoughtful argument, this, that. Like you can just say, hey, code wins arguments, let's try it and see. You can A/B test your way through almost any design decision you can imagine. That can lend itself to getting lazy too. Some things really don't need to and shouldn't be A/B tested. But a lot of the times when people are just having these conflicts over what is the right thing to do, at Facebook, we have this silver bullet, which is, well, let's try them both and see. Load testing is another good example, right? Like if you want to build infrastructure that will scale, like you might have to sit down, and come up with like a load testing scheme, figure out how you're going to get enough, there's a real problem for small startups. It's like, how do I even, how do I even simulate enough load? Or I don't have like a large enough amount of hardware, or whatever it may be. And, at Facebook, you can really, if you're developing a feature and you want to sort of first get the feature developed and then you want to figure out how to make it scale, you can kind of ship in that order. You can turn it on for 1%, then you can turn it up to 2, 3, 5%. And if at anywhere along the way you find that, oops, something's falling over, oops, we found a bottleneck that we didn't know about, you just can dial back to 3%, fix that bottleneck and keep going. And so, so the sort of, instead of having to anticipate everything up front and design for it, the ability to sort of throw something at the wall, see what sticks, see what doesn't stick and fix it and proceed ends up being a really high throughput way to develop.
I agree. Now, let's talk a little bit about the politics of an organization who may be kind of stuck in the past and kind of an old way of doing business where it was more traditional monolithic release cycles. Mm-hmm. Let's say they're embracing continuous integration. Mm-hmm. Maybe not yet continuous deployment, but let's say there's just experimenting with continuous integration for now. Mm-hmm. And they're used to having, like the marketing department approve everything that goes out to make sure things look consistent from a branding perspective. Let's make sure, in some organizations, the CEO himself or herself needs to look over any big releases that happen that may affect them, because, it's important for the organization sometimes to be respected and to look good and to not show off something that might be half-assed or buggy, to their audience. So from a political perspective, how can individual developers be nimble and agile in environments like that?
Well, so first of all, I want to say, I think it's appropriate. I think it's appropriate if you only have a couple of release vehicles a year. I think it's appropriate, even if you're web-based, if your customers are enterprises and betting their business on your software, like to not push half-assed features at them, right? Like what enables Facebook to be Facebook is partially the fact that it's web, but mostly it's the fact that it's free. So I think that, it's fine to have the bar to say, okay, our priorities as an entity, as a company is that we don't want to be half-assed, that we want to be buttoned up and high quality before customers see it. If you're a developer in that environment, I think continuous integration is still like one of the best ways to ensure that you deliver really high quality software and that you deliver it on time. And, that's at least gives you the benefit of internal feedback cycles, because the benefit of continuous integration and continuous deployment in my mind is about feedback cycles, is about you don't waste time going off in the wrong direction. You get feedback in real time and you get to fix what you're doing in real time. So I think that the next best thing after sort of continuous internal integration, the next best way to be nimble and sort of not next best, the even better way that falls short of external deployment is beta program. And this is actually one of the unsung secrets of VMware's quality, was we ran immense beta programs that lasted, 6 months, 9 months, and had tens of thousands of people enrolled in them. And it was a tremendous vehicle for hardening the quality and delivering really bulletproof enterprise software out at the other end once we were ready to declare it GA. And the beauty of beta software is once somebody makes up their mind that they're beta testing for you, your relationship with them really changes. I mean, first of all, you can ship a lot more often because they're willing to update all the time because they're invested in helping you. And you can also put really crappy bugs in front of them and they don't care, first of all, because they know they're beta testing, and so hopefully they have not put anything mission critical into the beta test. But second of all, what I've been astonished is once people identify themselves as helping you, they're proud to find bugs. It's exciting. It means they're sort of accomplishing their purpose. And so you actually things that if you did them to your real life production users, change the software all the time, make them reinstall all the time, throw crappy half-baked bugs at them, things that would make those customers outraged at you, just make beta testers love you more. So it also surprisingly, it's this kind of crazy win-win where it's actually a way to strengthen your relationship with customers. And hopefully, marketing can also feel a little more easygoing because things that go out under the beta umbrella sort of aren't precedent setting and aren't binding for you. So So I think that, you know, as much as the banner of this talk is, there are no silver bullets. I think, you know, beta tests are kind of a silver bullet. I think there's, no matter what quadrant you're in, they're really good and healthy for you.
I completely agree. And in fact, there's this equation for happiness that I use in life, which is happiness equals reality minus expectations.
Right.
And the idea of a beta program is kind of like just setting expectations lower, right?
That's right.
And then happiness can only be high from there.
But it's not even that they have low expectations. It's also that their expectation is that they're helping you.
Right.
And that is really profound, like really profoundly changes your relationship with your customers or with your users. I think it's kind of a special thing. And I think, by the way, it's profound for developers too, because the other thing that happens in beta programs, you know, when you sell software, you know, maybe not so much at startups, but as your company gets larger, you really don't get much direct access to the customer. If they have problems with the software, they go through support, and you know, if they want some features, they talk to sales or maybe a product manager. But you know, in beta programs, developers tend to get to interact directly with customers too, and to sort of really see the impact of your software on the people using it, and sort of, you know, kind of see users as real people and not just kind of a faceless audience. And you know, I think that's you know, I think as an engineer, I find that so valuable and so helpful. I mean, it's motivational. It motivates me to work hard, but it also just gives me insight into who I'm building for and what I'm building.
Absolutely. So now that you've kind of had the chance to transition to a more independent role where you're advising startups and investing in startups, how do you feel, where do you think in the future you're going to be more passionate? Is it going to be investing and advising and making an impact to lots of startups at once? Or do you think that you might one day go back into building mode again and devote yourself to one company? Where do you think you're happiest?
Yeah. Well, I spent my whole career sort of putting all the eggs in one basket of, you know, one company, one product at a time. And so I definitely, a huge part of what I'm really enjoying about angel investing and advising is that I have a portfolio that I get to be really broad and leveraged across a whole lot of projects at once. So right now, that's what I'm enjoying the most. You know, after I've been doing this for 10, 15 years, maybe it'll swing back the other way.
That's great. Wow. Okay. So maybe we'll have time for one or two last questions before we sign off here. So, Mikhail, sorry if I mispronounced your name there, asks, what sorts of skills are you looking for to hire a person? So maybe another spin on that question might be, what are some best practices in interviewing processes in terms of how companies should be looking to hire developers? And it's actually kind of fascinating because you and I, we both actually worked at Trilogy years ago.
Yes.
And they had a very interesting interview process. And actually last night, we had a speaker here that gave a very interesting anti-argument to that interview process. He thinks that whiteboarding and code tests shouldn't be done. And he thinks that you should have the interviewee design their own interview process and not have a fixed, rigid interview process. And so there's some very interesting opinions that have been vocalized over the Hack Summit over the last day or two. So what's your personal take on interviewing? What's your process? What do you look for? What have you learned over the years?
Well, I think the most important thing is to start with the question that Mikhail asked, which is, what are you looking for? And I think that you have to know what you're looking for before you know how to design an interview process. I'm going to sound just like I do about software. You have to know what you want, and then you can design an interview process that gets you that, because it turns out that what you interview for is what you get. And what I like to see in engineers that I hire, you know, and it sort of differs. My lens was a little bit different at Trilogy, at my own startup, at VMware, and at Facebook. But I like to hire on potential. I like to hire for, I believe that I'm in this for the long term, and I want to hire people who have tremendous upside. You know, I do want to hire people who can do things right now and don't need a year of learning before they're going to be effective. But I'm definitely, I'm not of the opinion that if somebody doesn't already know how to do it. I mean, I just think technology is changing so fast that the half-life of any knowledge you have today is about 2 years. So your ability to learn really dwarfs what you already know. I think that attitude is really important. When I think over the numbers of people I've seen fired, like the really drastic failures tend to come more from teamwork and culture fit issues and less from capability issues. Maybe that's because we're better at interviewing for capability, but I don't like I think you just have to think about the culture of your company, and you know, are you going to be a place that can tolerate sort of the brilliant jerk, or not? And I don't mind some brilliant jerks. It depends on the way in which they're jerks, but it certainly requires a company in which you have the right kinds of projects for them to work on, and in which they do earn people's respect.
You know,
so I think once you've itemized, and then I think you need a mix. I think you need people with complementary strengths. You need people who are sort of willing to do the long, hard slog to really push things out the door and do the sort of 80% of the work that is the last mile. But you also need visionary thinkers who have the big ideas, even if they're not finishers. You need people who are willing to do the sort of slog, you know, oh God, there's, you know, 15 more bugs to fix, and you know, who's going to take pager duty this week, and who just kind of roll up their sleeves and can do. You know, Facebook famously really values bias to action. If you're uncertain, try something rather than try to figure it out. And so I think you can, it's situational, but those are some of the things I look for. And then as far as how you assess them, I don't love whiteboard interviews. I just don't know that we have a really better alternative. I mean, I think, you know, I've seen, you know, experimentation with laptops and IDEs. I think that's fine. I think that we need to be really conscious when we're using, but I think a whiteboard interview truthfully is just an instrument, and what you get out of it is how well calibrated the interviewer is at using the instrument. And I think that we just can't kid ourselves that whiteboard interviews are really testing somebody's ability to write code, because they're not. Like, no 30 lines of code. Like, you know, those tests usually rely on, do you have an algorithmic insight that you can then render in code? So they certainly do a good job of weeding out people who can't code at all. And tragically, lots of those people do show up in our interview processes for some reason. But they're really not going to find out, you know, nearly as much as sort of looking at somebody's GitHub repo, you know, what is their true coding ability as a software engineer? And we're kidding ourselves if we think that's what that interview does. I think it's a test of problem-solving skills and critical thinking more than anything else. So I think if we're conscious that that's what it is and that's what we're using it for, and I think I think one of the other biggest problems with whiteboard interviews as an instrument is that people lose their nerve. I don't think you can have a false positive on a whiteboard interview very easily. I don't think somebody can pretend to be able to solve a problem when they cannot, unless they've literally heard that question before. But I think what we get all the time with whiteboard interviews are false negatives. People lose their nerve, they lose their cool. This is too different from how they operate every day. And they look like they don't know how to code when they really do. And so I think that to the extent that is a problem with whiteboard interviews, a good interviewer can really correct for it by setting people at their ease, by establishing rapport, by realizing that you don't need to be fussy about semicolons, like that's not the point, and by reassuring people that what you're looking for is problem solving, by like interacting with them in a way that draws out the things you're looking for, which is how they problem solve, how smart they are. And so all these tools are flawed. I think that being a good interviewer is about using a variety of tools to see into somebody. And at the end of the day, I think no interview question is correlated with good signal. It's like the interviewer themselves. And I think it's just a skill that has to be built up. And once you've done thousands of interviews, I think you get pretty insightful, no matter what tools you're using.
Great, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Really, really appreciate you being here today. If you enjoyed Jocelyn's talk and you learned something significant today, then please consider making a donation to our coding nonprofits in the user interface on your screen. I'm sure they greatly appreciate your help, and you'll be helping very, very important, noteworthy causes. Jocelyn, thank you again for being here. It was fantastic, and I learned a lot, so thank you.
My pleasure, Ed.
And by the way, one last thing, are you available to take a few private questions from our audience, because we can have them join you and hang out for a few minutes off air? If not, they can tweet the questions to you. So
I probably have 5 more minutes, maybe 8 more minutes.
All right, so I'm going to paste the link there, and we'll be joining you in a second. Thanks, Jocelyn.